Good. For those who haven't been with us for the last 3 weeks, we've been reading from Esther. Esther, the orphan who's found herself queen of the Persian Empire. The king's 2IC, Haman, who had a generational hatred for the Jews, has a plan to kill them. But his plan has been uncovered. And the king was furious and has now killed Haman, putting him on a pole, on a stake. But the plan to kill the Jews is still underway. We need a solution. So join with me here. We're on page 30 of the booklet, week 4, Esther chapter 8. I'm going to be reading right through to the end of chapter 10. So that same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king. Esther had told now that he was related to her. And so the king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther then appointed him over Haman's estate. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. And then the king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favour, and thinks it's the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written, overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the human provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on a pole that he had set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as it seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring can be revoked." At once, royal secretaries were summoned, and on the 23rd day of the third month of the month of Sivan, they wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews, and to the satraps, the governors, and nobles of the 177 provinces stretching from India to Kush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on the day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers riding the royal horses went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honour. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness amongst the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many of the people of other nationalities became Jews, because the fear of the Jews had seized them. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out, and on this day the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. Now the tables were turned, and the Jews had hoped to overpower them. Now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces and satraps, the governors and the king's administrators helped the Jews because a fear of Mordecai seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace, and his reputation had spread through the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Plachadatha, Dalphon, Mispatha, Portha, Redalia, Aridatha, Lamashta, Arithai, Aridai, and Zithatha, the 10 kings of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay hands on their plunder. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. And the king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted." "If it pleases the king," Esther answered, "give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out on this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles." So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on their plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th, and they rested and made it an all day of feasting and joy. And that is why rural Jews, those living in the villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Now Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy, and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. And so the Jews agreed to continue the celebration that they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the pur, that is the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his sons should be impaled on poles. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur. Because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should, without fail, observe these 2 days every year, in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and in every city, and these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out amongst their descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are they not written in the book of the annals of the king of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent amongst the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Amen.
Hey, thanks so much, Tim, for reading that. And that was a long reading. Can I say thank you to all the Bible readers who have read this during this campaign? Because if you're one of those people who's like, I'm going to read the Bible in a year this year, I'm going to read the whole thing from cover to cover. Good news, we've just done Esther together. You don't have to worry about that one. Hello and welcome. If you're joining us this week, you are visiting with us today, or if you're trying to work out if Renew is going to be your church home here in Canberra. It's really great to be with you, where this is our final week in our campaign Secret Identities, looking at this book. And if you're feeling bad that you've missed out, or like you're dropping in the last week, don't feel bad. It's all right. You can watch back on at the talks on YouTube if you would like. They're all there. In fact, you might be doing that right now. This is better. Anyway, let me pray, and I'm going to get into it. Okay, let me pray. Gracious Lord and loving Heavenly Father, what a strange way to end this story. Lord, would you please show us new and beautiful things about the gospel as we kind of try to make sense of the way this book ends in a way that we might not have expected. We ask that for Jesus' sake. Amen. I mentioned at the start of this campaign that I reached out to the ACT Jewish Council to let them know that we're studying the Book of Esther and we're thinking of them. Because, of course, as we've just read, Esther ends with the establishment of the festival of Purim today. And in fact, that celebration is next weekend. They'll be celebrating that next weekend. It's a festival about the joy of salvation coming from unexpected places. But given the events of Bondi last year, I suspect Purim is going to hit differently for our city's Jewish folk this year. And so I reached out and said, hey, is there anything that our church could do as an act of kindness for your community, given the circumstances? And they got back to me this week and they said, thank you so much. They were really touched by the kind offer and asked, given the what the Festival of Purim is about, could we please make a donation to a charity of our choice in their name, which I'm going to do. At Purim each year, there's a certain food that they eat. It's called a hamantash. There's a recipe in your booklets for hamantash, so you can have a go at it. It's kind of, how we have like certain foods that we reserve only for Christmas. Hamantash is a bit like that. Floria, our eldest daughter, makes some, and so I'm going to eat one right now in your presence. If that's okay. It's good. It's really good. I've got some more over there. You're welcome to try some. Now, I'm going to read something else. Just tick. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to feed on Christ in my heart, my faith and with thanksgiving. Now, what do those two meals that I've just had have in common? I mean, there are differences. There are differences between the two. But in the kind of Venn diagram between the Jewish festival of Purim and the Lord's Supper, what is the bit in the middle? What do they both represent? They are both about deliverance and rest, aren't they? In Esther 9, verses 17 and 18, we're told that the people rested from their enemies and had a day of feasting and joy. rest is one of the great promises of God in the Old Testament. Um, uh, I haven't had a full night's sleep in months. Little boy, Augie, keeps coming into our bed in like early in the morning and wakes me up and does that thing where he kind of, instead of sleeping like this, he sleeps like this. And it's like kicking him, it's like, all right, back to bed, kind of thing. Rest is beautiful, isn't it? Rest is so great. Um, God promises rest. God's people had rest from their enemies in this moment, but we need to know that rest is so vanishingly rare in the Old Testament. You know, you read the story of God's people in Old Israel, and they are constantly being assailed by their enemies. So you've got like Pharaoh enslaving them. Then they're attacked on their way to the Promised Land, and then they're attacked in the Promised Land, and then they're carted out of the Promised Land, all by enemies, and they're just constantly under attack. You read the book of the Psalms, the songs of God's people. I don't know if you've noticed this, if you've ever read through these things, but at least 80% of them are asking for deliverance from enemies. And worse than that, they, like all of us, were incredibly good at sabotaging their own rest. We all have our own enemy within, don't we? I've not done this, but it'd be really interesting to go through the Old Testament and just read story after story after story and think, is this a problem where baddies are coming from the outside, or is this a problem where they're making dumb decisions and so that's why they're suffering, or is it a bit of a two? I wonder which of those two piles you think would be bigger. Um, Regardless, every now and again, in the story of God's people, they have these moments, these beautiful moments where everyone just exhales. They're given rest, beautiful rest. Don't you long for rest? You might think, you might not think you've got enemies. Some of you know you do. Uh, but there is something wrong with the world, isn't there? Many of us move through life hoping not to bump into that person down the shops, or not to press that button because when they get going, whoa, used, abused, ignored, attacked, bullied, enemies foreign, enemies domestic, enemies that we've created by our own thoughtlessness or callousness or cruelty or pride. Some of you, as I'm speaking, sorry, a bit of Hermitage. Some of you, as you're speaking, have people fixing in your mind right now. People who gaslighted you, people who undermined you, people who exploited you, who badmouthed you, people who come at you in violence. Rest from your enemies. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Don't you want that? As we look at this story today, as we look up at the wrap up of the book of Esther, we're going to be talking about three things, okay? How Esther got rest from her enemies, that's the first thing. Secondly, how Jesus gives us rest from our enemies. And then thirdly, how you can have rest from your enemies. All right. Let's start. How Esther got rest. Thanks, man. Let's have a look at the story. I remember last week in community groups in church, we saw the downfall of Haman. Haman was the living embodiment of that proverb, pride goes before a fall. He was ruined, impaled on his own pole because he believed his own hype. He believed he was deserving of honor. He craved it. And so when he didn't get it, he went out over his own skis and and God brought him down. But Haman's part in this story isn't completely over. His death machine is still raging. Remember, he had sneakily gotten the king to issue a decree that on a particular day, all the Jewish people throughout the empire would be slaughtered. The king, who wasn't really a details guy, details got in the way of his drinking. So he just kind of waved it off and away it went. The decree had been galloped all over the Persian Empire by the greatest postal service the world had ever seen. Esther knows that seeing Haman off hasn't solved that problem. And so look at verse 3 there. If you've got it in your booklets, it's printed there too. Verse 3. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. This is extraordinary. Remember, Mordecai wasn't allowed to go into the king because he was wearing sackcloth and ashes and publicly weeping. You couldn't be like that in the king's presence. The king apparently liked to keep things light. At that time, Esther was embarrassed of Mordecai's behavior, but now she goes in for it. Uh, Esther's publicly mourning before the king. She asked him, verse 3, to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite. Literally, she's asking for a Passover. That's what she's asking for. Did you see that little footnote there in your booklets? She's asking for a Passover. I'm sure Xerxes didn't get the significance of that. How could he? But she's asking for something as serious as God's rescue from of God's people from the hands of the Egyptians centuries before. She says, verse 5, if it pleases the king, and if he regards me with favour and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. Now, how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? And you might think, sure, do it, Xerxes. Just your wife's asking. Just haul the whole thing off. You want your wife killed because you were sloppy with the paperwork. But there's a problem. It's a problem that shows up in the book of Daniel as well. The Persians had this kind of cultural quirk. Um, because their kings were seen as demigods, they were very demigods, to revoke a law of the king would be like us scratching out one of the Ten Commandments or something like that. Can't be done. But again, Xerxes, not really Captain Smallprint, says to Mordecai and Esther, okay, you guys can figure this out. And second half of verse 8. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. The ring, the one that was on Haman's hand, has been taken off his hand, put back on the king, and now the king's taken it off and given it to Mordecai. Mordecai now has the yes to all stamp from the king. So, how do you stop a genocide without stopping a genocide? How do you help the king to save face while saving the necks of God's people? What would you do? What would you do? Actually, this is a room full of smart people who many of you in your work have to come up with elegant solutions all the time. Um, what would you do in this situation? You can't cancel the previous order. Um, you've got to work with what's there. How would you fix it? Why don't you have a chat with the people around you and see if you can figure out a solution to this problem? How would you fix the problem of how would you end this genocide? Have a chat. How would you stop this genocide? What would you do? Right, come on back. Did anyone come up with a good solution? Uh, or did anyone you were talking to come up with a good solution? Yeah, Eilish.
Good solution that was come up with was that whatever, because it says they should do this. It says, but if you do, there will be consequences. So whatever you do to these things will also be done to you. Or
Uh, sure. So you could say like, you should do this, but just so you know, everyone who does do it, something bad will happen to them. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Other ideas?
You could probably mandate not getting out of bed that day.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good one. So you could say a lockdown. Sorry, there's a plague going through. It's social distance everywhere. Yeah, good one. That's clever. Yep.
Notice the king had so much power.
Yes.
Just use that name.
Could it just nice one? That's great, Len. I love that. So from now on, there is no 14th day later. Yeah. Yep.
Like a solution to the problem. Really actually doing such because such is that you're going to like that.
Indeed. Yes.
That's like the only solution is to create at the same time. Far away. It's far away.
Yeah. So you could say every Jewish person of Jewish ancestry gather in this one spot for 24 hours, and then we'll fortify that. Just make it really difficult to attack. Yep. Fight back. Quite right. Yeah, it's very confusing, isn't it? Good one, team. So I just want to honour you in coming up with all those different ideas. That was really good. Mordecai and Esther, they hatch a plan. People can still attack the Jews, that's fine, but the Jews are now able to defend themselves and they can plunder whoever attacks them. It says, yep, the original decree still stands, but now the tables have turned, the stakes are raised. You could lose everything if you attack the Jewish people. And with this second decree, the opinion polls shifted as well. People had been bewildered at Haman's decree, but now people of other nationalities would fight alongside God's people. Mordecai probably thought, well, they'll take care of that, because who in their right mind would take up arms against God's people now? But then we discover in chapter 9 that people still did. The big day arrived, the day that Haman had rolled the dice and determined 11 months before, and God's people had the upper hand, but there was great bloodshed, wasn't there? Thousands of people died. Even though it was perfectly legal to do so, no one put their hands on the plunder. They didn't take it because they wanted everyone in the empire to know that it was about justice and self-defense. This was not an attempt to enrich themselves. Esther even, this is weird, isn't it? Esther even arranges for an extra day of this to go on. After 11 months of crippling anxiety that God's people had this sword of Damocles hanging over their head. Finally, their enemies are done. And can you imagine the relief that they would have had? Wouldn't it be incredible? I just imagine like putting my sword away for the day, going, "Cool, that's done. I don't need to worry about that anymore." And yet, in the story of God's people of old Israel, it never lasts long, does it? That rest, that deliverance, it's worth remembering that the festival of Purim precisely because of how fleeting it really is. It never seems to stick. That's the funny thing about killing your enemies into peace. Your enemies will have kids, and then you've got to kill them as well. And it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. If you feel a bit weird about the ending of Esther, like, hang on, isn't Esther meant to be like the good one? Like, you're not wrong to experience that. I often think with the stories of Old Testament, of the Old Testament, we expect them to operate a bit like the sitcoms we watch. They're meant to kind of tie up neatly in a bow. If you come to the book of Esther and you grew up as a Christian and your exposure to this story was through talking vegetables, then you might have the impression that this story does end up neatly and tie up in a bow neatly, but it doesn't, does it? It's kind of ugly and inelegant, and thousands of people die. Thousands of people die. It's a little hint that this is not a completed story. It's strange because, as I mentioned, rest is one of the great promises of God in the Old Testament. If it's such a big promise, why doesn't it ever last? And that's why the later prophets started to speak of a rest that would last and what it would take. They promised a Messiah who would come to vanquish God's people properly. vanquish the people's enemies properly, lastingly, in a way that meant they would have lasting rest. And along comes Jesus. And now we're up to point number 2, how Jesus gives rest from our enemies. Jesus arrives on the scene 480 years later, after the story of Esther. He says, I am the Son of Man. I am the Messiah that you've been promised. He says in Matthew chapter 11, come with me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. I will give you rest. And his first followers heard that and they thought, beauty. That's wonderful. He's going to save us from our enemies. So there's this bit in Luke 8 when Jesus is facing opposition from the Samaritans, a neighbouring people, and we read verse 54. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them? The Old Testament is full of this stuff, right? Destruction of enemies. You're the Messiah, right, Jesus? You're here to vanquish our enemies. Let's start now with them. Fire, shooting fire. Burr, 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 burr. Let's get them. But Jesus rebukes them. He says no. And then he says even more crazy things. He says, love your enemies. Forgive them. Forgive them 70 times, 7 times. And the disciples would have been thinking, wait, this is what was promised on the box. Enemies vanquished. That's what we're meant to get. Smote them, thou mighty smiter. We want rest. And near the very end, when he's in the garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus' enemies come for him with swords and clubs. We're going to look at this in a few weeks in the lead up to Easter. One of the disciples, Peter, he takes out his sword and says, this is the moment! And Jesus says, put it down. He goes with them. And even as they are executing him there, even as he is expiring on that cross, he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Why? Is this one of those Old Testament, New Testament things? The Old Testament God is mighty and the New Testament God is loving you, or something like that. No. What we see on the cross, Jesus Christ loving his enemies, forgiving his enemies, dying for his enemies, is the ultimate warfare against evil. And it brings the ultimate rest from our enemies. In Galatians chapter 3, Paul tells us Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming cursed for us, where it is said, cursed is anyone who is hung on a pole. He redeemed us so that by faith we might receive the promise of the Spirit. Jesus didn't come down to tell us not to worry about all that judgy stuff in the Old Testament. Of course Jesus believed in judgment, the judgment of God on evil. Jesus talked more about hell than anyone else in the Bible. Of course he believed that stuff. You have to believe that stuff if you're a loving person. Loving people don't turn a blind eye to evil, do they? But Jesus Christ reveals that he is not just wanting to get us to get rid of our enemies, but to get rid of enmity itself. Not just enemies, but enmity. He wants to undo the rust that is eating away at the world that he loves. In Ephesians chapter 2, we're told that on the cross, Jesus slashed down the barrier of hostility. He slew the enmity that divides human beings. If Jesus had fought alongside Peter in the garden that evening, if he had taken out a sword as well, he would have killed a Roman garrison. There'd be another one. But when he died on the cross, he was withdrawing sin and death itself. He became curse. He was hung on a pole like Haman. He became as ugly as Haman to turn away divine wrath. How is that the ultimate warfare? Like this. If someone wrongs you in some way, say at work or whatever, I think most people would suggest that you are perfectly within your rights to react back. Say by letting everyone know that you were wronged. So those two have their reputation. That's natural. That's the natural mode of the human heart. Someone else does something evil, and so we respond with evil and hurt. Like them back. And if you do that well, You'll get rest from your enemy for a while, but you'll never touch the enmity. Only, uh, so if you only hit your enemy, you've just made the enemy worse. When you fight evil with evil, you don't win. Evil wins, and it wins in two ways. Firstly, it affects you. You become harder and colder, and maybe even more self-righteous. But then, secondly, they'll be back, or their children, or their side of the story, or their cause, or their nation. The enemy gets worse. It goes on and on and on because we're playing whack-a-mole with our enemies and never touching the enmity. You know, Peter says we overcome evil with good. In 1 Peter chapter 3, he has the audacity to say, do not repay evil for evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called. We respond with what the novelist Flannery O'Connor called the violence of grace. The violence of grace. That little phrase, the violence of grace, only Flannery O'Connor could come up with that. It's beautiful, it's perfect. It sounds like a trick. It sounds like trying to make being a doormat appealing or something, doesn't it? In Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, do you know it? We meet Jean Valjean. He'd been in prison for stealing bread for his family, and the prison experience had hardened him, hadn't it? In all kinds of ways. He became a bad man. And a bishop kind of takes him in when no one else will. And that night, while the bishop is sleeping, Jean Valjean makes off with the bishop's silverware. The next day, the bishop is in his garden, and a group of police show up. They come with Jean Valjean cuffed. They've got the bag and they've got the silver with them. And they say, look, we found a thief. And the bishop is visibly angry. And you know what he says? He says, Jean Valjean, I'm glad to see you. Well, how's this? I gave you the candlesticks too, which are silver like the rest. And for which you can certainly get 200 francs. Why did you not carry them away with the forks and the spoons also? And he gets the candlesticks and he puts them in the bag as well. And the police are confused, but they uncuff Jean Valjean and they leave. And then it's just the two men. And the bishop says to Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I buy back from you. I withdraw it from the black thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God. And later, Victor Hugo writes, the pardon of the priest was the hardest assault, the most formidable attack which Jean Valjean had yet sustained. He realized that if he yielded to this grace, he'd have to renounce his hatred of all the people who had wronged him. And he didn't want to do that. But he examined his life, and it seemed horrible to him, his soul, and it seemed frightful to him. In the meantime, a gentle light rested over his life, and he wept and he prayed. Grace is violent in the very best way. Because when grace is applied, it opens up the possibility that enemies might become friends. And that is exactly what Jesus did for us at the cross. The bishop's grace assaulted Jean Valjean. The freeness of it broke him. And if that's what happens with a few candlesticks, imagine how much more the glorious Son of God spent for you and do in your life. Grace destroys enmity. His grace turns enemies into friends. And when you grasp that, it changes you from an enemy to a friend. And it sends you out into the world with rest from your enemies. Third point, very briefly. If you understand the gospel, the good news of Jesus, you get rest from your enemies in two ways. Do you believe that Jesus Christ had to die for you? That nothing less than the Son of God giving his life as a substitute for you will make you clean. That is a humbling thought, isn't it? And that realization, it actually vaccinates your heart. It vaccinates your heart against self-righteousness. You realize you're not better than other people. And and that means your enemies can't make you hate them. And if you don't hate them, your enemies lose their power to control your life. So that's the first thing the gospel does. It humbles you so that you're able to resist responding to evil with hurt. But the second thing the gospel teaches us is that we are valued and affirmed. Jesus was willing to die for you. He didn't just have to die for you. He saw you and went, I'm willing to die for you because I love you. What an honor. He did it to welcome you into his family, a treasure that cannot perish or spoil or fade. You have a new life and a new creation to look forward to. It is this right now, our life right now, is as close to hell as you are ever going to get. And you know how that gives you rest from your enemies? If that's your identity, your new citizenship, your new adoption, your new status as a royal priest in the kingdom, that makes you bulletproof. It's the only thing that can. If your self-worth is tied up with your actual worth, then you'll be destroyed in a market downturn. If your treasure is stored up where moth and rust don't destroy, or where thieves don't break in and steal, you can weather any difficulty that we have in the financial world, safe in the knowledge that your Father loves you. Your enemy can't touch you. If your self-worth is tied up in your reputation, then you will do everything to project a certain image. And if anyone threatens that image, they speak poorly of you, you'll be destroyed, or you will be run ragged trying to destroy them. But if you know that the God of the universe thinks you're beautiful, that he applauds you, that you have the praise of the praiseworthy, that he is delighted in you, then gossip and slander lose their sting, because who cares? My Heavenly Father loves me. He thinks I'm great. And that's not going anywhere. In fact, there are Christians around the world today whose very lives are going to be threatened for the cause of Christ even this week. But do you know what? Even if their lives are taken, that act of will catapult into resurrection life, where happiness and satisfaction and rest are the order of every day. To the extent we understand that we are loved by God, our enemies don't have a weapon that can harm us. And you know what that means? It means that you can have rest right now. It means you can be an agent of rest in our city right now. You can move out into the world in a way that promotes peace, that sees enemies over time become friends. They won't always, not 100% of the time. Grace, after all, is harrowing, but the God that humbles us, the God that lifts us up, is like rocket fuel, sending us out into the world to meet evil with good. After a moment of prayer and question time, we're going to move into the Lord's Supper. You're all going to get a go at celebrating that meal that I celebrated just before. And we're going to celebrate the rest that Jesus won for us, hard won for us at the cross. As we do, let's remember what the gospel means about us. Wretched sinners, ridiculously loved. Let me pray. Gracious Lord and loving Heavenly Father, we praise you for your love for us. Father, thank you that Jesus is the only one who can end the enmity between people. and see enemies become friends. Father, we long for the day when fighting and just the unpleasantness that comes with knowing that we have people in this world who want ill of us and we want ill of them will be done. Lord, please hasten that day, the day when we get to see Jesus face to face. We ask it for Christ's sake. Amen.